Welcome back to Watchbox Studios and Watches Tonight. I am your host, Tim Mosso, and we are back in action tonight. We're turning the time machine back to the 1990s and an era that watch collectors seem to have largely forgotten, with Rolex, Patek, AP, Zenith, Vacheron, and Lange milestones. The 1990s come to life tonight alongside a pop culture narrative. All of this and viewer wrist shots on Watches Tonight. There is no better place because they pay me, but also because I'm a customer, than thewatchbox.com when the time comes to buy, trade, or sell watches. Let me be frank, they keep these pixels alive. But at the same time, having bought, sold, and traded watches, I can tell you we're fast, we're fun, and if you want to play frequently, we are the best stop on the web. Open up a different window, keep me streaming, and check thewatchbox.com. Also, and this is a shameless plug because it's a private Instagram, join me, Tim_Mosso on Instagram. Help me to fill the gap and hit 50K in 2K19. I have an all-video Instagram account where you can literally binge watch my 1-minute videos of the best selections from our vault, and that's where I put some of the less commercially viable stuff, the watch nerd watches, not just the steel Rolex, where you and I can geek out, and I'm very good at responding to comments on Insta. All right, viewer wrist shots, you guys are sounding off, but you've also rang in. Toady S starts us with an IWC family reunion. Jared S shoots a superb macro of his Zenith Defy El Primero 21 caliber 9004. Send me more macros, guys. If they're all that good, I'm game. Roy S hits the water park with the kids and his Panerai Luminor Marina PAM 48, a great size for a Luminor. And Louis P sails the high seas with his Vacheron Overseas Generation 1 military dial. Send your wrist shots to Monday Mailbag at thewatchbox.com to see your pieces on my pixels. Let's take a look at who's in the box tonight. We got friends Martin joining us from the UK. We've got Horology homies from Long Island, my neck of the woods. We've got Turkey Vulture, True Live from Toronto, Steve Bowden, Ant Fraser, Strapped In, Jack Purcell. We've got Thomas Von W joining from Munich, Germany. Thank you for staying late in Europe. We've got Sean M. from my time zone, Charleston, South Carolina, Simon Holt from Northern Ireland, and we've got Aaron Edgerton joining us from Brisbane, Australia, getting up early. We've also got Fat in Space joining us from Jerusalem, so staying up late. All right, guys, tonight we are talking about the 90s. I love the 90s. I am a child of the 90s, and I want you to reconsider the relevance of the 1990s to the watch collector because we've got great stuff. Looking back, it's true. Watch collectors of our era have an attitude towards the 1990s that roughly parallels the pop culture conception of the Dark Ages in Europe, the early medieval period when all was angst, sturm, drang, and plague, and we looked back to the glory of a faded glory of classical antiquity. Well, the 1990s weren't all that bad, but let's look at some of the stereotypes. The 1990s was an era of awkward two-tone, from brands no longer considered hip, of tiny watches, for women but also for men, and of quartz everything, men's, women's, dress, sports watch, it was everywhere. And the lean years of the quartz crisis were only a decade removed from the moment at the beginning of the 90s, and the renaissance of our era, yours and mine, was easy to miss in its earliest stages. Tonight, the 1990s gets it due from a collector's perspective. Okay, jumping into the box real quick, I want to acknowledge you guys one more time. We got Marcus W. from Denmark. We've got Eric Cecil from New York City. We've got Max Van Rossum joining us from the Netherlands. And Clement from France says hi. France is in tonight's episode. Thank you for watching. All right, 1990, the end of history. It's true, Francis Fukuyama's somewhat ambitiously and prematurely titled text didn't come for another 2 years, but it certainly felt like the end of history. The Cold War was drawing to a sharp close, and there was a changing of the guard at every level from government to culture. Look at the world of Formula One. I'm sure you're fans. I know I am, but we were looking at a world title of the new decade, the first of the new decade, going to Brazil's Ayrton Senna. This Senna's second title was won over rival Alain Prost's Ferrari. Ferrari, a great name from a previous era, but going through difficult times. And the winning machine, Senna's McLaren Honda, upset the balance of power on and off the track, a trend continuing from the late 1980s. The big development, 1990, there was the Honda NSX, the fruit of those labors, and road test last developed by Ayrton Senna. It gave Ferrari's 348 the scare of its life and generally forced Maranello to reconsider its build quality. That's what I mean by a cultural changing of the guard. Now, jumping along to the World Cup in Italy, pointedly, the first World Cup of the 90s, was won by the final flourish of the West German soccer team, just prior to its formal reunification with the former East in the fall. It's also worth mentioning that in the former East, Walter Lange, great-grandson of Glashütte watchmaking pioneer F.A. Lange, re-established the historic name for the first time since the pre-communist era. Now, this is a watchmaking tradition dating back to 1845 and his own kin, but there wouldn't be any watches, not immediately. That would take 4 full years of research and development, but the fire had been lit. Now, the watch of the year 1990, in my opinion, it was the IWC Grand Complication, 42 millimeters here in platinum. This was the ultimate watch of its time, at least from Schaffhausen. A minute repeater, a perpetual calendar, mechanically programmed, a moon phase with an aventurine moon phase disc, automatic winding with a chronograph, made in 50 pieces per precious metal per year. Hanno Bircher designed it. He was an IWC design star at the time. Kurt Claus designed the perpetual calendar system, mechanically programmed. Renaud Papy, pre-Audemars Piguet, designed the minute repeater. It's like an anthology of the best of watchmaking, and I mention it because collectors, today, you can pick these up for about 80 grand, and while they're not cheap, for what you're getting, it's a steal with pedigree. 1991, jump into the next year of the decade, transitional references on and off the wrist. 1991 began as, in many ways, a final gasp of the 1980s, a last hurrah for the Hollywood action hero in the form of Terminator 2, Arnold's last straight-faced action blockbuster. The film was the highest grossing movie internationally, all box offices around the world combined, with a then unheard of $517 million. For perspective, Avengers Endgame has grossed so far in just a few weeks $2.7 billion globally. In sport, there were more signs of a changing time. A Japanese car won the 24 Hours of Le Mans for the first time as the rotary-powered Mazda 787B GTP simply outlasted a group of more heralded European-based competitors. And on the watch front, SIHH was created by 5 pioneering breakaway brands from what was then the Basel Watch and Jewelry Fair. Those initial brands, 2 of them don't even exist anymore. Daniel Roth, Gerald Genta, Piaget, Baume & Mercier, and Cartier. And given Cartier's outsized presence, the whole show was basically the Cartier show. Basel World felt no threat at the time, but again, as with Lange, a fire had been lit. Meanwhile, in the town of Le Sentier, a battered Jaeger-LeCoultre was basically pulling itself off the mat. The company had come so close in the late 1980s to actually being folded and sold off as copyrights and patents. It didn't happen. Thank goodness. And in 1991, the 60th anniversary Reverso bowed as a sort of celebration of the company's survival. In the Grantai case, 26 by 42 millimeters, as close as any Reverso has come to the true golden section rectangle. It was the first ever complicated Reverso with both a date and a power reserve, and it featured a 14-karat gold movement with a display caseback. It was the first in a series of 6 complicated rose gold Reversos, each built in 500 pieces, that helped JLC essentially rediscover its swing and its swagger, relearning how to do complicated watches. And if you are a JLC superfan, your ultimate ambition is to own all 6. 1992 was a year of gaining momentum, but before 92 gains momentum, let me see what you guys are saying right here. We have Freddie Turner saying the first Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, not the time to be flying Afghan air like I did. Turkischer Meister saying 1993 onwards were the glorious Clinton years. Boston rocked as always. Personal opinion, but I sanction any respectful personal opinion in the chat box. We are inclusive here. DK joining from Orlando, Florida, and Joshua Polanski, star of our recent collector conversation on Watchbox Studios, saying, glad JLC pulled through. You and me both, Josh. All right, and I could see Vegas Milgauss, he of the white-dialed Milgauss out in Las Vegas, USA, is listening to grunge Nirvana, music of the time. My man. And, of course, 1991, wanting to top himself. Let's see, how can you top yourself? 1991, Nirvana. That's about as grunge as it gets, but we will have more music references as the show goes on. So 1992, gaining momentum. I was going to highlight the top grossing movie of 1992, but it is almost uncomfortable to look back on the animated version of Aladdin and realize that's how Americans thought of the Middle East in 1992. Out of respect for your intelligence, as well as our many Middle Eastern guests, the movie is just too darn dated to showcase here, and there are many questions, ongoing questions about actual lessons learned right now because there is now another Aladdin movie. So we're just going to skip right over the culture part of 1992 and jump straight to the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak 20th anniversary. The 14802, this was the first Royal Oak Jumbo with a display caseback, a sublime watch made in 1,000 pieces to mark 20 years. Can you believe it was only 20 years back then since the first Royal Oak? And again, this is something that in hindsight must have felt like it was just the other day. 20 years ago, relative to us, was 1999, and it feels like we were all pulling our hair out over the Y2K bug 15 minutes ago, but it was worth the 20-year wait. This one featured the display case back, which was gorgeous and hand-decorated. We could finally see the JLC-based 2121 caliber, and it featured a fabulous octagonal boxed set, the likes of which I wish we could still get with our Royal Oaks. Now, there was more action on the Rolex front this time with the Yacht-Master. Dating back to the late 1980s, Rolex had been looking for a way to upgrade the Submariner in a way that was more consistent with Rolex's newfound role as a totem of status and stature, a luxury brand. Well, Rolex decided in 1988 it just couldn't do that to the Sub. So the Yacht-Master concept was forwarded as a standalone model with a solid gold bezel, new maxi-style indices on the dial, that beautiful white lacquer black index design you see right there, with the two-tone and a case form that had more in common with the Daytona than a Submariner. It was truly the luxury rotating bezel Rolex sports watch for an era in which Rolex simply was a synonym for luxury and a transcendent name in the watch space. A new brand. In 1992, we had Bell & Ross. Out of Paris, we had a Parisian brand looking to manufacture Swiss watches. How did it work out in the end? Well, you might note that Bell & Ross chronograph GMT looks an awful lot like a Zinn 144, and it's no coincidence, because back in the day, the first Bell & Ross watches for the first 10 years of the brand were made by Zinn Spezialuren of Frankfurt, Germany. Now, they had Swiss manufacture in those days, so if you're wondering why a Zinn-made watch says Swiss-made, that's the answer. But it was an interesting hybrid, and these are some of the most interesting and collectible Bell & Ross watches, because if you want a great Bell & Ross, the answer might be to buy a 1990s Zinn Bell & Ross. And they were called Bell & Ross by Zinn. So, what was going on at the high end of the market? Well, in a little bit of business news, Blancpain, which was bankrupt and effectively, like JLC almost became, just a name with a couple of copyrights in a shoebox of paper. Well, Jean-Claude Biver, in his first major watch brand rehab of an outstanding career, turned Blancpain around in 9 years and wound up selling something he bought for 20,000 Swiss francs for 60 million Swiss francs for what was then called SMH, the Society for Microelectronics and Horology, laterally the Swatch Group, and Blancpain became their first super luxury brand. Now, I should also mention that 1993 was a hell of a follow-up, a big name, a big year, and big watches to boot. On the cultural front, sands were shifting again. The Cold War was over, and it seemed for a period that the end of ideologies and great causes had given way to a rudderless world with no use for the institutions of the past half-century. A paradigm change from 1980s music and TV and film was underway. Music, metal, hair, glam, it was out. TV, bombast and pomp of shows like, for example, Miami Vice, fading fast. And on the film side, the action hero was almost a dead genre. I should also mention that as this shift occurred, comics got into the act. And you don't normally think about the gen pop or pop culture penetration of comics, but looking back from 2019, in which every second movie at the theater is a comic book movie, it's worth remembering that in 1993, a sign of the times, comics got in on the act, culminating in 1993's Superman number 75, the final installment of the Death of Superman story arc that asked readers to imagine a world without its ultimate hero, lawman, and moral compass. It was very 1993. But the world wasted no time in providing watch enthusiasts with equally iconoclastic options for a man of his times in the early 1990s. And these are watches that all still appeal in 2019, starting with Officine Panerai becoming an option for the first time for civvies. Can we go full screen with that picture right there, guys? Because that was the image that was being sold, something that had previously been military issue, available exclusively to the Italian Navy and its allies from 1936 right up until 1993. And the mythology, the mystique, the appeal was basically that you could wear something like they did. This was ambitious, and the first watches were actually launched in a ceremony on the fantail of the Italian naval destroyer Luigi Durand de la Pen, named after a World War II combat swimmer in the Italian Navy who led the raid on the British fleet at Alexandria wearing original Officine Panerai gear. Now, the first three models were the Luminor Marina, the Luminor, and the old Mare Nostrum chronograph. And if you bought a Panerai back in 1993, you got something that looked like this. These were early days, and many of these watches were made in Italy early on, making them exceptionally authentic, soulful, and collectible today. They weren't popular at first. It took adaptation by action heroes. Fading stars like Bruce Willis and Arnold got on board, and back in the day, early iterations of the online watch collector community, the earliest Paneristi, built this brand up in a way that its actual owners couldn't comprehend. The result being that very year, well, we'll get to it in a moment, Audemars Piguet decided that bigger truly was better, and this at an entirely different price point and segment. But the Royal Oak Offshore arrived in 1993, and there was a big back and forth internally at AP over whether or not they should build this thing. I can't say for a fact that Panerai gave them the decisive push. They were pretty obscure in 1993, but a trend was building. The 1993 Royal Oak Offshore 25721 and the 25770 on a strap were truly transformational watches. For AP and for the industry as a whole, what Panerai was pioneering, the oversized sports watch, AP was taking to the level of Swiss Holy Trinity and the Haute de Gamme, high horology, finish inside and out. Emmanuel Guet, a young watch designer in his early 20s, penned the thing. Gerald Genta's reaction was classic and a bit blinkered. He hated it. He said it ruined his Royal Oak, proving that even the wisest among us are sometimes bereft of hindsight. Recall that the 1972 Royal Oak was also met with a frosty reception. Well, he didn't like the Offshore 20 years later, but it's important to remember what this caused long term. AP would eventually become a brand monopolized by its twin pillars, the Royal Oak and the Royal Oak Offshore. We would get into the runaway limited editions of the 2000s when the Offshore threatened to overwhelm Audemars Piguet, depreciate its brand by volume and iteration, and for a period, actually called into question whether AP truly belonged in the Holy Trinity. But back in 1993, that was fresh, and you do not have a healthy and robust AP today without that watch, and for that matter, you probably don't have an Hublot Big Bang of any kind. So credit where credit's due, that thing was a trailblazer and an absolute supernova in 93. At a more accessible price point, perhaps the most important watch of 1993 was Omega's Seamaster Diver 300 meter. All of the classic elements were there from the beginning. The skeleton hands, the Omega wave dial, 41 millimeters, rotating bezel, helium escape valve, that multi-link bracelet that straddled the fence between dress and sport, chronometer certified 300 meter with a milled clasp not stamped, and a wonderful fold-out that forced Rolex to reconsider its stamped clasps. This was an important piece, and it's a testament to how good the design was that watch right there, the first reference, still looks an awful lot like our current 25th anniversary new for 2018 Diver 300 meter. That was the most important watch of 1993. I'll also mention it was a turnaround watch for Omega as a brand. Just as the offshore is probably responsible for the success and health of AP today, that watch helped to pull Omega, a then discredited and marginal distant second place, to Rolex, maybe even third place to Tag Heuer, and brought it back to the status and stature it enjoys today. The comeback watch was the Seamaster Diver. IWC also saw its moment, and it was a big one, as oversized sports watches were making their mark. The original oversized wristwatch, launched in 1939, the Portuguese from IWC, returned to series production for the 125th anniversary of the Schaffhausen manufacture in 1993. Now, it's important to remember that the Portuguese was a huge watch in 1939. It was never popular. If you add up every Portugueser made from 1939 to 1993, it's probably not more than 700 watches. So the Portuguese, as we know it today, began in 1993 with the resumption of series production. It would become ultimately one of the two pillars with the pilot's watches of today's IWC, and this is where that particular bonfire started. All right, 1994, the decade at a gallop. We were truly getting into the 1990s, culturally, economically, politically, and horologically. The 1990s were a curiously self-absorbed and moody period. Sometimes this self-awareness paid comic dividends. True Lies of 1994 proved that even Arnold and James Cameron sensed that the zeitgeist called for a send-up of their 1980s exploits, and they proved that they were giving the audience what they wanted. True Lies, one of the great action comedies of all time, very 1990s. You simply can't take it too seriously, and that's the beauty. The action hero trope was inherently absurd, so why not embrace that? That was Arnold's last truly great role. On track, a changing of the guard in Formula One as German Michael Schumacher took his first world title with Benetton. He would win 1 more in blue and 5 more in red over the next decade. He was a very different kind of champion. For folks who had grown used to the fiery F1 juggernauts, the champions, the outsized personalities of the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s, Schumacher was a very different kind of dominant force in the sport. Soft-spoken and a bit reserved, he was as understated as he was devastating. And while I wasn't a fan, he was very much a champion for the 90s, even a little bit of an anti-hero with a bit of a bad guy vibe, if you happen to be a Jacques Villeneuve or a Hill fan. Now, football. Real football, the foot kind that we don't play in the United States, arrived in my own country, the US of A, with the World Cup hosting a tournament won by Brazil. Okay, we didn't get very far. USA, we stink, at least on the men's side, we stink at association football, but this was a bigger deal to an American kid than you might think. Here's the paradox of football, real football in the United States. Right up to about age 14, you think we don't play it, but we do over here. Every single kid in the US, girl and boy, plays football. After that period, they stop. And they follow football. Very few kids are big enough or aggressive enough in our country to actually play the football that we all watch. But up to 14 years old, we all play the football that the world watches. And that's the weird dichotomy of football American and football global in the US of A. We actually all play it as kids. And then amnesia. Well, consider the albums of the year. I said this was the decade at a gallop. Weezer by Weezer, geek rock. Soundgarden, super unknown. We're getting deep into grunge. Green Day, whiny quasi-emo, proto-emo if you will, Dookie 1994, and Oasis definitely maybe pop grunge at its best. This could be the rock soundtrack of the decade if you strung it all together, and you look askance to the fact that by 1994, rap was closing fast as a pop medium. Still, you get my point. Those 4 albums were iconic, not just of the year, but of the era. The Reverso Minute Repeater, I have to mention it because this was part of that Rose Gold Reverso series. Consultation from Audemars Piguet, Renault et Papy, helping JLC design its first ever Reverso Minute Repeater and its first ever wristwatch minute repeater built as such from scratch. It's a fantastic piece, not just because if you want an iconic model with a minute repeater from a great brand, but because you want all of that and you want it at a great price. I'm throwing this watch in because I've seen these sell for 28 grand, and while that's a lot of money, we're into Boston Whaler, custom Harley Davidson, high-end Ducati territory. That point where a guy with a decent job could say, I could shift around some life priorities and maybe do this. If you want a minute repeater and a great one, that needs to be on your shopping list. 1994, 500 pieces. The first modern A Longa Unzona watches. Finally, the egg timer sounds. What do we get? We get 4 models. The Saxonia, the arcade shape watch, rectangular. We get the iconic and still produced Longa 1, the pillar of the brand, and we got the exciting Pour le Mérite Tourbillon, a watch so challenging with its combination of tourbillon and fusée that it required the best minds combined of Switzerland and Germany to accomplish. Only a few hundred watches were distributed, and then only to German distributors, but it was the beginning of something truly great and the birth of modern Saxon haute de gamme watchmaking. At the other end of the spectrum, 1994 saw the first Nomos Glasuta timepieces. Those are more modern Nomos pieces, but you get the idea. These were not watches designed to be priced equivalent to a high-end motorcycle, a boat, or a car of any kind. This was basically the Schwertner family saying, look, we're businessmen. We're going to create attractive watches at an accessible price, and we're going to make design our calling card. And 1994 was the beginning of the Nomos wave that we are riding to this day. 1995. Marking the time and the times, quite literally marking the timers. Swiss Hallmarks changed in 1995. This is how I always tell friends, if you want to get the rough age of a watch of the modern era, look at the Hallmark. The old Hallmark, if we can go full screen right there, was basically a Helvetic crest, a woman's head on 18-karat gold, or if you were looking at platinum, a goat head, an ibex. Ever since 1995, the new hallmarks for all precious metal Swiss watch parts has been the St. Bernard's head, which you see right there, with a very small stamped letter denoting the regional Swiss assay office that officiated. So you might get a G for a Geneva, you might get a Z for Zurich, you might get T for Ticino. That is the new post-1995 hallmark. Look for that on a watch, and you know at minimum, if it's Swiss or sold in Switzerland, it was made 1995 or later. In a confluence of pop culture and watches, GoldenEye, with Pierce Brosnan in his first turn as Agent 007, makes the Omega Seamaster 300 meter, the Diver 300 meter that we saw in 1993, an all-time legend. By any standard, long-term or short, this might have been the single greatest product placement deal in the history of luxury watches. People bought that watch immediately. I cannot tell you, all these years later, more than 2 decades on, 24 years hence, how many of those first-generation Diver 300s we still see? They sold a ton of them, and to this day, all the calling card design cues are still present, and the Bond Seamaster lives. Go, try and find a period that long, 25 years plus, of a constant in the Omega Seamaster catalog. From the very first in 1948, you cannot find a design that has lived that long. That sponsorship made the Seamaster what it is today, and it helped to make Omega what it is today. James Bond, I salute you, not because you're a real person, but because what you did for one of my favorite brands is absolutely authentic. There is no pretending that that's movie magic. That's the real deal. Timezone.com. On a cultural front, the internet finally started touching our lives as watch collectors. Think about the importance of that. The irony of overlooking the internet at this moment would be pointed, but this is how I got online in the early days and started learning about watches. It was founded in the Far East by a bunch of collectors from Singapore initially, and of course back then it looked like this. Can we go full screen with that, guys? GeoCities much? And if you recognize that GeoCities reference, you too, like yours truly, must be a child of the 90s. That was Rev 1. Gen 1, Day 1 of TimeZone.com. And although it was later eclipsed by watch forums and blogs and online journals and social media, don't understate the impact that this had on creating a generation of watch collectors, my generation and possibly yours. I should also mention that I used to read the Horologium articles written by Walt Odette where I learned about watchmaking, and I always aspired to leave one fraction of the footprint that Walt, the semi-mythical Walt Odette, left on the watch community. And 4,500 watch reviews later, I actually feel like I might be making a dent. But that's where it started for me, and that's really where it started for watches on the internet. Okay. 1996. We can, in fact, have nice things. Let's talk about them. At the box office, Scream reminds us that the 1990s was an era of paradoxical self-awareness and oblivious ignorance. We declared our triumphant conquest of horror movie conventions while failing to recognize that the same movie studio executives were still the ones laughing all the way to the bank. It was an unintentional metaphor for those times. But innovation was on the rise, with Patek Philippe launching the reference 5035 in 1996. The first ever annual calendar. These are still a great buy. They were simple in their execution, using only wheels, where previously a perpetual calendar would have required springs, levers, and wheels, as well as considerable hand adjustments. And this first in the industry complication dramatically decreased the price of owning a Patek Philippe complication. It was a seminal model for the brand and the industry as a whole, because you can now pick up used annual calendars for about $2,000 from some brands. This was a breakthrough watch. There was also Vacheron Constantin launching the overseas. AP, Patek, and now Vacheron were all in on the steel sports watch trend. And these were sports watches that were made in steel but given a precious metal price. And VC was back in the sports watch game for the first time since the 1970s reference 222 sports watch. It was an early, very early sign that sports watches were becoming the cornerstone of the entire luxury watch market, even at Swiss Holy Trinity levels. Jumping into the box right here, Easy E saying, I was only born in 1998, so this is pretty interesting to me. Vinny Ocean saying 1996, I was a freshman in high school. I can see Mark S saying Scream is an all-time great horror film. Matthew Lillard, wow. And remember, right after Scream in 1997, we got I Know What You Did Last Summer, making the self-conscious, ironic slasher genre a genre. Jumping back into the box, I can see right here, we got Brick Lane mentioning I Know What You Did Last Summer, and we've got Rick TikTok joining in with Robert Dixon, and Alvin joining us in from Singapore, the original ancestral home of Time Zone, and Eric Nielsen saying, Tim, Time Zone still looks like that. Well, there were 2 Time Zone slides. Time Zone still looks like the first one. Thank God it doesn't look like the second one. And jumping into the box, we got Bud to Stud asking, what do you guys think of the two-tone Sky Dweller? I'm saying it's worth buying, to answer your question, but you better have a 1,000 watt smile, because if you don't, your wrist is going to outshine the rest of your body. That is an extrovert's watch. If you're not into everyone seeing your giant, complicated, partially gold Rolex, I would pick the one that's steel and white gold. Okay, jumping back into our zeitgeist. 1996, Chopard becomes a manufacturer with a little help from Michel Parmigiani. Walt Odette, my hero, loved it, and the world largely looked away. Today, these are some of the best buys in pre-owned. A versatile 37mm size in precious metal, Geneva Hallmark, COSC chronometer certification, impeccable finishing, haute de gamme watchmaking and engineering. And again, you can buy them like that, full box, for around $10,000, sometimes less than $10,000 US. The market may be stupid, But our collectors who dig pre-owned are not. You guys are onto those things. They are scalding double certificate watches. In business news, 1996 saw the Tag Heuer IPO, shepherded along in part by later industry star Georges Kern. 1996 was the year Tag officially became the Tag Heuer of the modern era. The Tag and the Heuer existed prior, but this was a clean break with the 1980s private equity investment and a new era that ultimately led us to Tag as it is today, which included embracing history, as 1996 also saw the launch of the most important modern Carrera, the 1964 re-edition, powered by the same La Manna base that's inside the Moonwatch. These are the best modern Tag Heuer watches to buy from a collector's and connoisseur's standpoint, and 1996 was year one. Georges Kern would later be heard from as the man who built up the modern IWC and the man currently charged with the turnaround of Breitling. 1997, sea changes. In a story with ongoing cultural and current events resonance for the watch world and the wider world, Britain passed Hong Kong back to Chinese rule. To this day, it should be remembered, over 14% of all Swiss luxury watch exports pass through Hong Kong, a traditionally open and free marketplace that serves as the regional distribution hub to Asia in general, as well as being a formidable and substantial watch collectors marketplace in its own right. This is a story, if you've been watching the headlines, that continues. It's relevant to the world and the watch world equally. 1997, Panerai launched the first ever radiomir. Remember, in the early days, radiomir was not a watch. It was a radium-based paint that was put on watches. The first modern radiomir was the PAM-21, 60 pieces, platinum, with an exceptional Rolex modified Côte d'Ivoire pocket watch movement from the original Officine Panerai era. This is the ultimate modern Panerai to buy. Not only was it the watch to buy in 1997, but Panerai was the brand to buy. So much so that the Vendôme Group, the predecessor to the modern Richemont and basically a Cartier benefit, purchased the Italian Officine Panerai in 1997. The legend is that they found the parts for the 60 PAM-21s ready for assembly after paying just under $2 million for the brand, and the sale price of those watches paid the cost of acquiring Panerai. That was the beginning of the post-Vendôme era. Now, I'll also mention that Patek Philippe was getting into the sports watch scene hard and heavy with the Aquanaut. This was a watch that represented a cultural change. The original 1,000-piece 36mm reference 5060A was the first of the Aquanauts and the first Patek Philippe with a rubber strap attached. Heretical at the time, this one was designed for mass production. With a case and a bezel that was simpler to assemble and finish than the Nautilus, this was a product of the 90s, but very much a watch with the 21st century in its sights. At the same time, for those who prefer to soar rather than swim, Zenith launched its first ever flyback El Primero caliber in the Rainbow Flyback chronograph of 1997, probably the last mechanical watch built to fulfill a military contract for French naval aviation. The flyback today, to you and me, is one of the most collectible, desirable, and underrated watches of the 1990s, and proof that today when we talk about vintage, the 90s needs to be on our radar, especially in this, the 50th anniversary of the original El Primero. If I were to buy one El Primero, it would be the Rainbow Flyback. 1998, how it went down, quite literally. We start with the biggest film of the year, Titanic. In 1998, earns a shocking $1 billion globally. Remarkable, considering everyone going into the theater already knows how the movie ends. I had a history teacher at the time who warned us all, look, before you spend your money, I gotta tell you the bad news. The boat sinks. I still saw it. I didn't cry, but it was a cultural phenomenon, and it owned the box office for a sizable chunk of 1998. Absurd, yes, but a sign of the times. In an era without great causes or ideologies, we fill in the blank. The thrill of victory. For our friends in France, the 1998 World Cup provided the ultimate Francophile experience as the host nation beat the reigning champions from Brazil and played the Marseillaise on home soil. That was the thrill of victory. There was also the agony of defeat for France. At the Tour de France, the Festina affair, near and dear to my heart as a cyclist, saw the world's most viewed sporting event in convulsions as Dozens of riders were arrested, withdrawn, or quit outright mid-race following blanket police raids of team hotels. They found everything except the kitchen sink, although I'm sure that was on the search list. A race that started with 189 riders finished with less than 100, some of them in the clink. That was not French sport's finest hours, but basking in the glow of the World Cup, who the hell cared? Now, SMH, a company with an unmemorable name and an unmemorable acronym, officially became the Swatch Group, now one of the major brand owners among the luxury watch groups of the 21st century. In other Swatch news, the Omega Speedmaster X-33, the watch that I will someday own, launched in its first iteration as the Mars watch. This is a true NASA-issued watch, and it was developed and tested accordingly. This is a real modern space timepiece and an underrated late model classic. It was made from 1998 till 2006 for the public, a little longer after that for military aviators who wanted it. But this is a timepiece that everyone needs to give a second chance because it's one of the greats of the 90s and one of the great speedmasters of all time. Not just of its era, but of all time. Patek Philippe, I should mention, launched the first complicated Nautilus in 1998, the 3710 1A. And not only was it the first complicated Patek Philippe Nautilus with a power reserve, complication never used on any other Patek watch, but it was a very different looking watch with baton hands, lit Roman numerals, a tritium dial, and that power reserve that featured both the swoosh scale and the hand moving concurrently. Along with the 3712 of 2005 and the original 3700 Jumbo, this 3710 forms part of the Nautilus mini trilogy of uber collectibles that's almost a collecting theme within a theme. Patek, yes. Nautilus, yes. But if you really want the ultimate Nautilus collection, 3710, 3700, and 3712 is the way to go. Jumping into our box, we have the B-Tube saying Swatch, the best watches ever. I do happen to like Swatch right here. And I can see we've got Tobias Lagerstrom saying football, not soccer. That's correct. I'll call it association football to distinguish real football played with feet from American football, which is mostly played with hands. And then I can see right here, NS something saying, then Lance Armstrong pretended he is not doped for 10 to 15 years. That's true. And in 1999, he took home his first ill-gotten gains. The big lie, as they say. And this one is not on France. 1999 was out with a bang. Richard Mille established his eponymous watch brand. A French watch executive, not a watchmaker. By the way, can that guy pick winners or what? It continues to this day. But he created his namesake brand with buy-in from Audemars Piguet and technical support from APRP. Richard Mille, who again clearly knows how to pick the right folks for his brand, wouldn't launch his first actual watches until the RM1 in 2001, but the name and the roadmap for the brand were products of the 1990s. Another Frenchman, this one with an actual watchmaker's credit, and I have to say, background dating back to the late 1970s, this guy was the real deal, and soon his name would be known. But he launched his first product, the Tourbillon Remontoir, in 20 pieces, a subscription piece for early adopters of the newly minted F.P. Journe brand of Geneva. As with Abraham Louis Breguet, the first pieces were sold to those who paid up front in a subscription series, which is why if you see the first 20 Tourbillon Remontoir watches, A, they're really crude, but B, there's actually 1 through 20 numbering on the dial above the hours and minutes. The very first F.P. Journe timepiece built under his own name in a wristwatch format. Alonga Unzona pegged the meter with the first ever datograph, a watch that is largely considered to have done to Patek Philippe what the Acura NSX did to Ferrari. It was a huge wake-up call in finishing, in engineering, in no-compromise execution of every single part. The datograph was the chronograph of the 1990s, and it happened in the last gasps of the decade. The datograph, 20 years old in 2019, is the watch on which Lange continues to hang its hat, not just as the haute de gamme in German watchmaking, but as a revolutionary brand that changed the industry. Omega launches the first mass-production co-axial escapement, designed by British watchmaker George Daniels in 1974, the first 99 pieces in yellow gold, 99 pieces in rose gold, 99 pieces with salmon dial, pie pan constellation dial in platinum, came out in 1999. It's said that of the platinum watches, the 99 pieces, George Daniels personally oversaw the construction and the tuning of those movements. This was a seminal moment for Omega. So this year, as you celebrate 20 years of the dado, put in a thought, spare a thought, for 20 years of the George Daniels co-axial escapement in Omega watches. Finally, LVMH bought Tag Heuer and Zenith in a move that foreshadowed the consolidation of the industry under massive groups during the 2000s. It was a shadow of the future looming large over 1999. Not only did LVMH buy Tag and Zenith, but Swatch bought Breguet and La Manna to provide the movements. Guys, that's the 1990s. Viewer wrist shots come next. Tim M, the other Tim M, relaxes with coffee and Rolex in the Southwest United Kingdom. Amin S and his German-made Bulova double digital shoot the breeze in Boston. Peter B is on the cutting edge with his new hydromechanical HYT H1 in DLC titanium. Wear it in great health. I love the watch and I love the brand. And Fahad A of Qatar, home of the 2022 World Cup, scores 2 with his Omega Seamaster Swiss Boutique Edition and Range Rover Sport. I hope to take him up on his offer to visit the games in 3 years. Send your wrist shots to mondaymailbag@thewatchbox.com to see your analog on my digital. Of course, I want to thank everyone who joined in the box today. You guys absolutely killed it in the live chat right here. We got the Provincial Gentry saying the Rafa Nadal is made of glass, though. He's a injury-prone guy. And I could see the watch lounge saying closing in on 500 people watching. Impressive. Thank you, guys. Brick Lane for you car enthusiasts, correctly noting that 1998 was the last of the air-cooled 911s, the 993, the ultimate 911 in my heart and in our heads. I think we're thinking and feeling the same thing there, right there. And we've got Kevin S. saying Tim needs to just buy that X-33. And we've got Paul S. saying in 1999, the remake of the Thomas Crown Affair, also with Pierce Brosnan, he wore a Reverso, helping to reestablish the brand internationally. And we've got Y2K Madness from Mez944. You guys are on top of the times. You got the zeitgeist. Guys, join me on Instagram after the broadcast, Tim_Mosso. Open up another window, pick up your phone, follow me. Watch reviews posted daily, 1-minute videos, and of course, comment and subscribe below. Thank you for joining me. Thanks to you, thanks to my crew. Time out, Tim out. I love the 90s, and thanks for logging on.